Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Hi. So many wonderful friends here tonight. Thank you for being here. I'm Lisa Krauser. I'm the Edward W. Kane Executive Director here at the Concord Museum. And thank you all for joining us tonight, both those who are here with us in the Churchill and Janet Franklin Lyceum and to all of our virtual viewers, of which there are many tonight. It's a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's forum, which is a conversation with Concord Museum curator David Wood and Professor Robert A. Gross to discuss David's new book, Eyewitness to Revolution, the American Revolution Collection at the Concord Museum. The publication of this book coincides with David's 40th anniversary as curator at the museum. Aside from Cummings Davis, the founder of the museum who started our great collection, no one individual has had a greater impact on the museum than David. His deep knowledge, rigorous connoisseurship, and overall joy and enthusiasm for Concord's history and our collections is unparalleled. David has planned and executed nearly 100 exhibitions at the museum, and this is his third book celebrating our great collection. It's truly an honor to be in David's presence each day and to learn from him. Tonight, David will be in conversation with Robert A. Gross, the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Professor of Early American History Emeritus at the University of Connecticut. Bob's first book, The Minutemen and Their World, won the Bancroft Prize in American History. Picador Books has just released a revised and expanded edition ahead of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. His most recent book, The Transcendentalists and Their World, won the 2022 Gomes Memorial Book Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Professor Gross is a trustee of the Concord Museum and a director of the Thoreau Society of America. He's also an honorary fellow at the Mass Historical Society. Having David and Bob together in conversation is like having the brain trust of all of Concord's history in one room. So I also want to share my deepest appreciation to Allison Schilling, our Deputy Director and Director of Engagement. Allison worked with David over the past 2 years to shape this manuscript from its inception into a beautiful book. She supported David through many key production decisions with her outstanding project management skills. So Eyewitness to Revolution received funding support from many friends of the museum, including the Decorative Arts Trust, Prize for Excellence in Innovation, Anna and Neil Rasmussen, Marty Wallace and Ed Kane, Ryan and Kathy Hanley, and Gibbs and Sue Roddy. This publication would not have been possible without all of them. I would also like to extend a very special thank you to Claire and Joshua Nelson for the support of Museum's forums for the 250th anniversary, as well as the Sally Lanigan Fund for generously endowing our forum series. So after tonight's forum, we'll have a book signing and reception in Burke Hall where you entered, and I hope you can stay for this gathering. So please join me in welcoming David Wood and Bob Gross.
Well, good evening. David, it's such a thrill to be here with you, seeing once again, bound in the pages of a lavishly illustrated book, your organization of Concord's history. You know, I've seen you do it before, and you do it again here, and you draw people in, and you get them to look and listen and see Concord anew. So I'm going to ask you questions to get you to elaborate on what's in the book, and then maybe we can see, are there any controversial parts of it? You do such a good job of making everything seem so perfectly acceptable that we don't know what's hidden behind the surface. So this is a book that I would call, in a way, a documentary history of the American Revolution in Concord. If we take document not just to mean pamphlets and engravings and commissions and manuscripts, but also the whole world of artifacts. And you give us essentially a chronological history of the revolution as it bore upon Concord, and show us step by step British actions and colonial, provincial, and then Concord responses. But you also say in the note on sources that the goal of Eyewitness to Revolution is to allow the items in the Concord Museum collection to each tell their part of the story. In sympathy with the inherently first-person nature of material culture objects, the sources for these stories are in large part the words of participants. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you get the objects to talk.
That was the goal, to get the objects to tell their part of the story. And then the difficulty that arose almost immediately was the fact that the collection's so good that it tells a little too much story than I was necessarily prepared for. But it is that combination of the first-person objects. I would just single out the group of things associated with April 19th. They were there. The things in our collection were there. So that's a great start. And then it was a deliberate choice to then look at the first person accounts of what happened that day, and there are many of them, and not just the official ones. There are, they occur in journals, they occur in correspondence. That beautiful series of depositions that the Provincial Congress ordered just days after. That's the sources, So I wanted to know, from the vantage of the participants, what happened. That was really the question. So what happened? And to say specifically what happened on April 19th, but also what led up to that. And as I said, we have these objects that are milestones to that. I begin in 1760, in large part because that's where our collection begins with respect to this subject. But that 15-year odyssey is sort of the heart of the matter.
So why did you start with the objects you do, starting in 1760?
Well, because we have one of the James Wolfe firebacks. So this is a cast iron piece that goes in your fireplace to keep you from burning the bricks at the back of your chimney. It's a sacrificial slab of iron, but this made by an iron founder in Boston named Webb, probably around 1761 or not long after that. And we had one in the collection. It seemed like a good place to begin, because that moment when General Wolfe conquered Quebec. Conquered is the word that the Canadians use for what happened in 1760. So James Wolfe conquered Quebec, died in the offing, became an instant hero, became a household word for bravery in England, and was a great favorite of folks in Boston. So it seemed like a good place to begin. When France vacated Canada, the picture changed.
And you're also saying, look at how much identification with the British Empire people had. Look at how much pride they had that they were British Americans. And, it's not simply a sentiment, it's something that you build into the very artifacts of your household. And so as you're walking around, as you're using that furnace, the oven, there it is. You're part of a larger world, and you're going to tell the story of how it is that people who had those kind of artifacts and patriotic decorations are going to turn against the very empire.
There are a number of things in the book, because they're in our collection, whose proper home was the parlor. I think in significant ways, the parlor was one of the theaters where this whole process was played out. It's in the pulpit, sort of. It's definitely in town meeting, but it's in the parlor too. And what you just cited, the fireback is an excellent case in point. James Wolfe is ever present with you in your parlor.
You're mentioning the parlor brings out something that point you make, which is that for much of the history of the Concord Museum, these artifacts that can speak to Concord and the Revolution were not on view. The period rooms dominated the display of the collection, and you didn't have a real focus on here's the artifacts from the Revolution until we did I Concord, and then we did the special exhibit on April 19th.
No, that is the case. They were hiding in plain sight most of the time, and of course the documents, being paper, are generally not on view at all. So it is a way of bringing these things forward in another dimension.
Mm-hmm. So I was struck, looking at the various objects, at the fact that so many of the people involved in either creating them or owning or using them were not from Concord. They were from Boston. And if someone were coming to this exhibit thinking, this is going to be a local history of the Revolution, would they be surprised?
Well, Boston is a neighbor. I mean, that's fair to say. No, that is the case.
With an overstated ego.
Concord's material culture is to a considerable degree Boston's material culture. That's where you get your stuff from, and the that back and forth gets played out politically as well. Concord is well situated in a couple of ways, in that it's close to Boston but not too close. It was an okay place to stash the war material that was being assembled.
Well, I was thinking that what you have are objects that furnish people's homes, decorate, clothing they wear, the fashions, the styles, sometimes the very materials, come from Boston and the wider world. And then people in Concord, like people in Sudbury or anywhere else, learn about them, react. If they have the means, they buy them, especially in the 18th century world, to advertise their identification with cosmopolitanism, with the British Empire. So it's, you could say, cosmopolitan initiative, local response.
It is, yeah. And this too, it's the moment of the consumer revolution. This is the moment of Josiah Wedgwood and so following, and people were excited to, these are new forms, they're new finishes, new colors, new, here comes the East introduced as motifs, and that's, that had barely landed, literally, this is a phenomenon of the 1760s in a large degree, barely landed when, for political reasons, people had to make the decision, I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm not going to take that anymore. I'm going to refuse to import that. Not just, so it's economic leverage, effective to a degree, economic leverage, but it's a renunciation of as you said, people were very proud to be part of the British Empire.
So maybe we should subtitle this A Consumer's History of the American Revolution.
We could begin with with an image, in that, this comes back to that notion of parlor. So this is Paul Revere's Bloody Massacre, recording what happened on March 5th, 1770, when one of the ubiquitous street crowds in Boston taunted a group of members of the 29th Regiment, and they reached a flashpoint, and the civilians were fired on, 5 of them killed. And within weeks, Paul Revere was offering this print for sale, and this is the way you could get it, hand-colored and already framed and glazed, and it's ready to go in your parlor. And if you hang that in your parlor, anyone who comes into your parlor knows exactly where you stand politically. This is a dead giveaway. And this particular one, there are a number of these that survive, but I don't really know many. Only the Pauline Revere Fair example is the only one I can think of offhand where the original owner is known. But in this case, we know the original owner. It's Emerson Cogswell, who was a hatter in Boston and was in Concord by 1774, and on April 19th was at the North Bridge as a member of David Brown's Minute Company. So, you know, this is not only a nice example of Revere's work to a degree. Revere cut a couple of corners in order to get this on the market so quickly, borrowing the motif from Henry Pelham. Henry Pelham was not too happy about that, but and it was also out early enough to influence public opinion about the event, even before the trial. Josiah Quincy Jr. mentions this print at the trial, saying that it's, you know, it's corrupting the way people think about what happened, and that's just because you can see the captain is raising a sword as if giving an order. The troops are firing in unison. There's firing coming from the Customs House, which is renamed Butcher's Hall for this print. Well, the unison firing, the order, the firing from Customs House, those things in the course of the trial turned out they never happened. But here they are in the print.
So there are a couple of things I would add to this. One is that, so Emerson Cogswell comes to Concord after this event, and if we were to say, how did people in Concord react to the news of the Boston Massacre? Well, town meeting never met to adopt a resolution to condemn the British soldiers. There was no policy ground on which to say to recommend to the general court to do something, so it would be unlikely that they'd gather. So there'd be no record, and you'd say, I guess nobody in Concord cared at all about what happened on March 5th, 1770. But here we know somebody cared a great deal. And the person who cared would come to Concord. He was a hatter, not usually a craft that's going to make you super rich. In fact, he wasn't at all super rich, but he was a founder of the social circle. And I think the family originated in Lynn, Massachusetts. And so you've got that part of the story, but there's something else that I'll bring in here, which is in the front of the crowd that evening on March 5th in 1770 in Boston, taunting the soldiers, was Thomas Theodore Bliss, the brother-in-law of the Reverend William Emerson, and the brother of the Loyalist lawyer Daniel Bliss, who wrote the John Jack epitaph. And so, and Emerson's diary doesn't refer to any of his kinsmen in Boston, but he does go into the city to see what's been going on. And you can guess that underneath that is, how is Thomas Theodore? Is he okay? And he can tell me what was going on. It's not at all clear from what's been written whether Thomas Theodore Bliss helped to provoke the shooting or was somehow caught up in the crowd and didn't mean to do things. But he ends up being one of the key witnesses for the prosecution of the British soldiers. So here again, you get still more of a Concord story. And one of the aspects of this I would add here is that, so a number of these artifacts are not Concord produced, they're Concord preserved. And I think that would be another slogan for the museum. Concord produced and Concord preserved, or just Concord preserved.
Should we, yeah, if we move on to the next one, we have an opportunity to return to the parlor, because this is a work of embroidery. It's a needlework coat of arms that's worked by Mary Jones, who was about 20 when this was completed, or nearly completed. And Mary Jones decided at a parlous moment to go to school in Boston, to go to one of the more fashionable schools in Boston, the one kept by Amy and Elizabeth Cumming. And Amy and Elizabeth Cumming were merchants in Boston who opened this school as a sideline. The Cumming sisters were importing the very materials that this is made of. It's a black satin ground, and it's worked in colored silk threads. All those are imports. All those are English imports. You know, as I mentioned, the embargo cuts you off from these fashionable English things. The Cumming sisters didn't play along. They did not sign the non-consumption pacts under great pressure. Their names were printed weekly in the Boston newspaper as, you know, they were singled out with just a small handful of others as people who were not complying with the non-consumption, who are, in other words, friends of government and not friends of the resistance. Amy or Elizabeth Cumming witnessed one of the most horrific episodes in this pageant of street theater that began in considerable degree with the Stamp Act in 1765, that pageant of hanging a tax stamp official in effigy on an old tree that everybody knew down by the docks, that after that night was ever after called Liberty Tree. And so that street theater accelerated over the next few years, even after the repeal of the Stamp Act. During the real issue was the resistance to the Townshend Acts, and that's where the Cumming sisters got in Dutch. But Elizabeth Cumming witnessed the assassination attempt on the publisher, John Mean, who was cheeky enough to search the import records and publish the names of people who had signed the non-importation pact, but nevertheless were importing English goods for sale. They nearly killed Mean, and then they not exactly the same crowd, but another crowd. These were busy nights in Boston. Then attacked a customs informant named George Gaylor, and Elizabeth thought they were going to kill George Gaylor. Gaylor was tarred and feathered, and it was just a horrific scene. And if you can imagine trying to go to school in that setting, that's what Mary Jones was trying to do. But the evidence on this object itself suggests that it didn't last. So there are some passages that are incomplete. This is one of a group of possibly 20 or so that are closely related. They are all after designs by John Gore, even though they are produced by 3 or 4, maybe as many as 6 different schools in Boston over a considerable span, even after the end of the Revolution. But the evidence of this it's got these folds in it. So it was folded up into a square, about a 5-inch square, and I think that was the moment when Mary Jones decided to bail, to get out of Boston and go back home to Weston. And not too long after that, Amy and Elizabeth Cumming also left Boston and came back home to Concord. So here is Concord participating in Boston's cultural life at the very highest level.
Yeah. And I believe this work of unfinished embroidery is hanging on the walls now in Whose Revolution.
It is.
So you can all see it when you see the rest of that exhibit. And we should tell people that Mary Jones is the daughter of Colonel Elisha Jones of Weston, who has, if my memory serves correctly, 13 children. The first 12 were boys. A rare instance of gender expansiveness, still trying for a girl. So, and Mary Jones married her father was one of the most politically powerful and richest men in provincial Massachusetts. He was a strong supporter of Governor Hutchinson. He was a close ally of Concord's Charles Prescott. And he would take the Loyalist side along with a couple of his sons. He would go into Boston. He died there during the siege. But his sons fought for the British, and other sons fought for the Patriots. His daughter Mary weds the Reverend Asa Dunbar, and they stay. They don't defect to the British side, but her husband Asa gives up being a minister, becomes a lawyer. They live in Keene, New Hampshire. He dies. She marries, for her second husband, Jonas Minot, whose home on Virginia Road is the Thoreau birthhouse. It's the Thoreau birthhouse because Elisha was the great-grandfather of Henry David Thoreau. So you have this extraordinary set of connections that take you back to Robert Cumming, the the father of the Amy and Elizabeth, and also the father of Concord's great man, Colonel John Cumming. And the father is a Scottish immigrant. And I believe the father was shipped to the colonies for participation in one of the Scottish risings.
Yeah.
So if you're shipped to the colonies in punishment for opposing the crown, do you think you're going to pass on to your children that rebellion's a good thing?
Mary must have gotten a taste for adventure too, because when one of Mary's brothers was captured trying to bring some supplies into Boston during the siege, he was imprisoned in Concord and feared for his life, wanted all of his meals to be brought from home, from Mary from Weston, who accommodated, but also secreted knives with the food, so they cut their way out of the jail. Concord's jail was remarkably porous. So jailbreak. And it's actually Henry Thoreau who tells us this story in the journal, but also woven into that is, of course, an ecological note as well, in that Mary brought ripe cherries to her brother in jail in June of 1775, and Thoreau comments in the journal, it really was an early spring, just as they say, the grain was waving in the fields and the apple trees were in blossom. It had to be early for the cherries to be ripe in June.
And Thoreau also tells us about the great uncle who breaks the jail, makes his way through back roads to Weston, where he is helped out by a black slave to make his way. So that's the one way we know that Henry David Thoreau descended from slaveholders, a point he never, ever makes publicly. And even when we get his reference to the name of the enslaved man in his journal, he doesn't say anything about the status of the man. really unusual thing, but you can see here that just this one object takes us through so many conquered stories, backwards and forwards in time. And so I wonder if you might, I read this book also as a tribute to your predecessor, Cummings Davis, whom you now rival for tenure.
Apparently, I heard that story. Yeah.
But Davis comes to Concord, and he still can have contact with people who knew people who go back then. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how he built the collection and what you think he did that was unusual and innovative for his time.
Well, I haven't sorted it out. I'm not quite sure how Davis managed to do it. I sometimes blame Davis's friendship with Henry Thoreau, who was a remarkably sophisticated material culture historian. And because Davis was, I would say, imperfectly educated, got to the 9th grade at the Groton Academy, and was not a man of particular means, sold refreshments at the train station, delivered newspapers. Cummings Davis delivered newspapers to Louisa May Alcott just up Lexington Road here, but somehow assembled this collection of about 2,000 objects by the 1880s. And Davis's insistence is clear in the objects. It's not their form, that formally this is a wonderful thing, but if it didn't have a history, Davis wasn't interested. So that's a great boon for us, that the things that Davis collected with their histories. And some of them come from the grandchildren. Henry Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson are both grandchildren of active participants in the Revolution. It is that generation, and Davis knew a number of grandchildren of participants, and many of the objects in the collection, like the lantern, the iconic lantern, came from the grandson of someone who was present in the 1780s to acquire it in the first place. So that it was those connections, but it's that interest. There were very few people collecting the objects at that point. There's just the beginnings. There are a few people, but not very many. So it's not quite.
I wonder if Cummings Davis's interest in the vernacular and everyday grew out of the fact that he was a pretty humble guy who wasn't starstruck with the Concord elite. And so he had, in that sense, a more democratic approach to collecting. And we could say that since he grew up in Brooklyn, he was another figure whom Thoreau could be associated with, who contained multitudes.
That is interesting. We have a slide, actually. I don't know where it is. I've lost track of this, if that's all right. But it would be a few more in. I'm thinking of maybe this actually. So this is a looking glass that's lost much of its silvering that happens on occasion. But it's a mirror, and Davis collected it with its history that it belonged to a man named Casey, C-A-S-E, but apparently it's pronounced Casey. And Casey had a distinctive saga, but was enslaved in Boston, enslaved by the muster master of the Concord militia, Samuel Whitney. And so given that relationship, there are other similar relationships where it's clear that if someone's going into the field right here at the beginning of the Revolution, they may very well take someone enslaved in the household with them. So it's legitimate to suspect that Casey Whitney was at the North Bridge, and that Whitney was armed, and when ordered to fire on the British regulars, followed the order the same way that the other folks at the bridge did. But you can count on few hands, I don't know how many, the number of objects that can be directly associated to owners in New England who were enslaved. And yet Cummings Davis acquired at least three, at least four, where really nobody else has any. And that again, it's sort of puzzling when we catch Davis behaving the way no one around is, and yet there's a drive there. There was an interest there, and it may just be, as you're saying, a democratizing impulse on Davis's part.
Well, actually, it makes me think that Cummings Davis could be viewed in democratizing the revolution the way George Robert Twelves Hughes, the shoemaker of Boston who was at the Tea Party, came to be, for the historian Alfred Young, the symbol of a revolution that was a people's revolution. I wonder if we could talk some more, though, about these looking glasses. So how did Cummings Davis end up with a looking glass associated with an enslaved man who became free during the Revolutionary era? And so how did he get it, and how did Casey end up with a looking glass?
I think the vector was George Minot, the Minot family. In fact, Cummings Davis refers to Casey Whitney, who also, while serving in the Continental Line during the Revolution, adopted the name Casey Feen, and I think the Feen may have African roots to it. The name, it's not entirely clear. But as I said, Davis refers to Casey as Casey Minot sometimes. And so I could see it being George Minot. George and Mary Minot were one of those spinster households that accumulated stuff from their ancestral families, some of which Thoreau looked at with interest, described in the journal. Some of them are in the collection here. So I believe that's how it went, because Davis had all these stories. Davis knew that Casey dreamt of Africa, and that Casey still mourned for the wife that was left behind. And I think that those stories possibly could only have come from George and Mary.
Yeah, and George Minot was the figure whom Thoreau sought out most in Concord, except for his friend Ellery Channing. There are more entries of his conversations with the man who was about the exact same age as Henry Thoreau's father, John. And it's fascinating here to realize that George Minot is another old-timer in Concord who bragged that he hadn't been in Boston in 40 years and that he never took a crop to market. He liked wilder, rougher Concord, like as in Thoreau's love of the wild. And he was never going to conform to a new way of life. Another figure from Concord who lives out my motto of resisting change since 1775. But it's really important here, because you start to see almost a people's history of collecting. And Thoreau gave some of these objects to Cummings Davis, and I'm guessing Sophia maybe passed along, his sister passed along this piece of embroidery. And so,
possibly.
Here again, so let's probe still more though, because you have the David Brown looking glass, which was cracked by a British soldier when they came and invaded the Brown household, which is on the very field overlooking the North Bridge. And you've got Casey's looking glass. So can we talk about looking glasses?
Sure.
It seems to me, so why? When were they invented? And, does the introduction of the looking glass tell us something about the history of the self as people understand it and the history of individualism.
Well, this, at the heart of these things, it's not the frame, it's the glass. And it's a technical thing to produce that glass. It has to be very particularly polished in order for it to be mirrored effectively. And this glass was not made in the colonies. It's English. And the English were best at glass. And they burned up so many forests making glass that there actually were acts of parliament to restrict that because they needed those trees for the Navy. But the glass industry was that big. And this stuff was expensive. So this act of breaking this glass, it was members of the 4th Light Infantry that were around David Brown's house. So the North Bridge is basically in David Brown's front yard. It was members of the 4th, and I like to think that the last thing this glass reflected was some member of the 4th with a musket just smashing the thing. It's a nasty, mean, low thing to do. And it takes no effort, but you've cost David Brown weeks and weeks, something that's worth weeks and weeks of labor just by this vindictive breaking the glass. But the family saved it, along with one piece of the glass down in the corner, and that label on the top is a 19th century label recording the family's history of this looking glass. And why would you keep a broken looking glass like this unless you've made the association with an important historical event? That too is one of the things about this collection that I kind of can't get over is, you see people doing this at the time, and I kind of think, well, how did they know? But they did. William Emerson saying in an almanac entry in April of 1775, this month remarkable for the greatest events of the present age. And it's like he knew that. He already knew that.
Well, people also create their own propaganda and then believe it. In this, they didn't know they were going to win. And had they lost, there'd be a lot of people who would have been backing away from. I didn't say that. Didn't you say that? There's though a good moment to turn then to what shapes the second half, I think, of this book, which is your real account of the Provincial Congress and the mobilization of an army and the work of organizing town after town to be ready to respond, and then the amassing of all the military supplies in Concord, as well as cannonballs. And so there we see a much more direct line from an outside agency, the Provincial Congress, but an outside agency is often in Concord with Concord people in charge of committees, making things happen.
So I think we have a copy of there it is. So this would be case in point. So the order to print this was made in Concord on April 10th, 1770. It was the April 5th, 1775, just 2 weeks before. But actually 3 days after that. Well, I'll back up a bit and just say that as soon as the Provincial Congress formed in October of 1774, they set out preparing themselves militarily. There was a committee of supplies established within weeks. They got the word out, don't give your tax money to Harrison Gray, give it to our guy. And although they didn't have that money in hand, they started spending it. The Provincial Congress allowed a £10,000 buying spree for military supplies, and those were being stored in, part of them were being stored in Concord. Again, it's half a day's ride from Boston. Boston was having a very difficult time sending any representatives of the Army into the country. They were really pent up in the city, so the stuff's in Concord. Although they knew about it, and the Provincial Congress knew that they knew about it, and so on. So there's this shell game going on at the very end. So that is what brought the regulars out on April 19th. There were mountains, literally mountains of supplies in Concord. There were 15,000 canteens, for one thing. The Provincial Congress had ordered, in very short order, we need supplies for an army of 15,000 that will keep the field. In other words, we don't need an army of 15,000 for one day. We need supplies for an army of 15,000 that's going to stay out there. And these are decisions they're making before the turn of the new year. This is in 1774 they're saying this. And actually just 3 days after ordering the printing of this, and these rules are basically what you get court-martialed for and how the court-martial goes. But they are for the Massachusetts Army. General Gage in Boston might say, I thought I had the Massachusetts Army, but they beg to differ. And just before it was the Massachusetts Army, the Congress referred to it as the Constitutional Army, because Gage said, what you're doing is unconstitutional, and they, thumbed their nose a bit. No, we're raising a constitutional army. Then it became the Provincial Army, and then a couple days later, it's the Massachusetts Army. And 3 days after the order to print this was made, the Provincial Congress says, we're going to raise the army. And they notify Connecticut of the fact, they notify New Hampshire of the fact, they notify the Stockbridge Band in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which had raised a minute company. They notify them, and the message is, we're doing this, are you with us? And the answer, although it's not recorded in the proceedings of the Congress, which was suddenly interrupted in their business, but the answer came on April 19th and in the days subsequent. They were with them. They did raise with the army.
And here's the really interesting thing, that the various objects that Cummings Davis collected and that you've gathered together and set out, tell us a story about how widespread was the military participation. It's not a story told through town meeting resolutions or town committees. It's rather the foot soldiers of revolution who are signing up. And that's really a valuable way both to get at the American Revolution and in some ways a problematic one. Because we've done this tonight, to merge the American Revolution with the War of Independence. And John Adams asked when the American Revolution began, he said, it was over before a shot was fired. It was a revolution in the hearts and minds of men. The war was not the revolution. Other people would say, well, actually, it wasn't over in the hearts and minds of men for a very long time. In fact, behind the scenes in the Provincial Congress, different factions were squabbling over how militant they should be and how resolute in response to General Gage. So that when they print this up, there were people who probably wanted to print it up 2 months earlier. So you've got a kind of politics behind the scenes, which is very hard to ferret out. But I wonder, do we have the commissions of Nathan Barrett and Eliezer Brooks there?
Yeah, there's one. Yeah, so this is Eliezer Brooks. The previous one is Nathan Barrett. And so these are from 1773, and they're signed by Thomas Hutchinson, lieutenant governor at that point, I think, not yet governor. But that's how it was done. It's the governor who appoints officers to the militia. Every town had one or more militia companies going back to the 17th century in Massachusetts Bay. And it's the governor who appoints the officers. And Hutchinson, in his later history of Massachusetts Bay, sort of pats himself on the back for the reorganization of the militia that he'd conducted in 1773, and this is a piece of evidence of it. And I would just say this partially printed document was engraved by the Boston silversmith, Nathaniel Hurd. And so Hutchinson says, I did a pretty good job choosing these folks, but in a way this and Barrett's commission kind of begged to differ because they resigned their commissions at the behest of or at the advice of the Provincial Congress. Resign your commissions, and now the officers will be appointed by town meeting. So this, when you talk about, as John Adams does, when the revolution is, I think if the revolution is thought of as the great turn from a monarchy to a republic, it was over. It was well over. It was over by October of 1774 when the democratically elected members of the House of Representatives resolved themselves into a provincial Congress. The advice that was given at constitutional conventions in Concord and Essex County and in Suffolk County, it is committee. This is government by committee. There's no chief executive. There's a president, but that president doesn't have the chief executive function. So these are the emblems of of that transition in the military.
So Barrett and Brooks resign their commissions and then are elected by the rank and file in their companies. And so that is itself a democratization of the military that parallels in some ways the changes that are taking place in the politics and governance of the towns in the Massachusetts Bay. And yet, these are hardly lowly people in social status. Brooks, I don't think we have this here, but Brooks decides, I'm going to be in the Provincial Congress. Why don't I get a portrait of myself done up?
Oh, we do. Do
we have that?
Yeah.
Okay, so he does not look like he's saying, I'm so glad we've had a democracy from the bottom up. He's saying, I'm glad I had the money to pay for this portrait.
And this is a portrait because it's by Benjamin Blythe of Salem, who was not in Salem long after 1774. One occasion where Brooks could have had this done, and I think it was the occasion, is when Brooks is in Salem to attend the Provincial Congress, and takes advantage of that to get the portrait done. I at least like to think of Eleazar Brooks in Congress wearing that wonderful coat.
So I think that we're just at time we should stop and take questions from people both in the audience and hi everybody out there in Zoom land.
Thank you, that was great. Do you have a favorite object or story that you put in the book?
That's a tough one. One of my favorites is actually a multiple object. We have about 60 flints that are the evidence for the fact that when the provincial troops, there were about 400 of them at the North Bridge, opposed to about 100 regulars who were holding the bridge at that moment. While they're standing there in the muster field on the horizon, in pretty much full view of those 100 regulars, they changed their flints. They were ordered to change their flints because the flints were discovered in two lines about 50 feet apart, facing the North Bridge. And there's documentary evidence of another sort that Joseph Hosmer, who was adjutant that day, put the minute companies in one line, put the militia in another line, and nowhere is it recorded that they were ordered to change their flints, but they were, because the flints that were recovered, some of them were damaged, some of them were brand new. So the order was clearly change your flints. And you do that because if you've got a fresh flint in there, your musket is much more likely to go off when you pull the trigger. And as I said, they're doing this, taking those out, dropping it right at their feet in view of the regulars. It's a highly provocative act.
You mentioned items from the parlor. How about from the kitchen?
From the kitchen. I've got one from the barn. One of the things that Cummings Davis collected was, didn't have to collect. It was a family thing. Davis's grandfather was Gershom Swan, who's in Boston, and had a tool. It's called a twivel. It's a tool that you take into the field to make rough and ready mortises when you're making things like sheep hurdles. But it's also apparently also good at opening up tea crates in order to dump them into Boston Harbor, because that's the history that's recorded on it, that Gershom Swan participated in the destruction of the tea and used a twivel to do it. It looks like a kitchen tool, but it isn't.
I have a question about the lantern. Some time back, you and I talked about, could the lantern be seen by Paul Revere in the tower? And someone was doing an experiment to see if you could actually see the light from that distance. Can you remind me of the outcome of that?
Sure. So it wasn't Revere who had to see it. The lantern signal was something Revere set up the weekend before April 18th. Revere had been sent to, it was Revere's job to ride with messages for the Provincial Congress. The receipts are in the state archives and Mass Historical. So Revere is in Lexington, stops off in Charlestown on the way back, and arranges with a colonel of the militia there this signal. Because everybody knew that there was going to be a raid on Concord where all the supplies were, because everybody knew the supplies were there. It's just they didn't know exactly when that would be, or by what route they would leave Boston. There are two ways out of Boston. One is out Roxbury Neck, which is that very skinny causeway that's even underwater sometimes in a neap tide. And that's one way out, only there is a fortress there that had been substantially reinforced. But Gage said it won't trouble anyone who doesn't trouble it, or words to that effect. So the other way is across the Charles River under the 70 cannon of the HMS Somerset under a nearly full moon. So Revere thought it might be difficult to get out of town. That's what the signal is for. One, if by land, that is, if they go out Roxbury Neck, there'll be one lantern in the belfry, and if they go across Charles River, there'll be two, because they're coming by sea. And the outcome of that experiment, there were two fellows from MIT who tried that out in the western part of the state where it's dark, and it does carry. But it certainly would not now. It is extraordinary to think of two candles, and they were there very briefly. They were not there for long because they were watching for the signal. Charlestown was watching for that signal. Everybody knew it was about to happen.
A candle in the wind.
That's it.
Can I take one more question?
Well, we'll have to make it up then.
Well, then I have a question for you about the very last slide. And that is the tea service of Henry Knox and Benjamin Lincoln. And I wonder, since we've been talking about ordinary people and the mobilization of townships, why you wanted to end with the top of the military elite?
Because that's where our collection ends. But yeah, so this is a partial tea service. This is Benjamin Lincoln's tea service. We have 30 pieces from that service, which is extensive there. So these were the Society of the Cincinnati were the field officers, were Washington's field officers. They formed themselves into a hereditary society in 1783, and frightened people at the moment. This was seen as a dangerous thing. They were going to raise money to relieve the indigent among themselves, or widows and so following, but there was no limit to put on to how much money they could raise. And so Eleazar Brooks actually wrote a critique of the Society of the Cincinnati for the Massachusetts legislature, saying, you know, we got to watch out for this impulse. And in a way, the conquered foil to this, the Democratic conquered foil to this, is the Social Circle, which was formed in 1782. Social Circle elects its members. They aren't hereditary.
Yeah, and this charge was that the Cincinnati were going to be a self-constituted aristocracy. Samuel Adams, actually in the press, anonymously led the charge against the Cincinnati and against special tea parties of the elite in Boston. And so the tensions between self-constituted aristocracies, happy with the inequality of the day, and ordinary people electing their own office. That's a key story in the American Revolution that didn't stop in 1776. So David, thank you so much.
Thank you.